All right, enough talks about getting ready for battle. Today we finally talk about what ship-to-ship combat in Skull and Bones is going to play like. After all, this will be a big part of this game's amazing success or monumental failure. So let's dive in. So the overall system is a weapon counter system we went over before, the different damage types weapons will do. So there was blunt, explosive, piercing, fire, flood, crushing, tearing. So the name of the game is matching damage type versus armor type. Some examples are like Greek fire is going to deal, of course, fire damage, but it's going to do bonus damage against metal armor. And if you use like a blunt culver in which metal armor is stronger against you, so it's going to do less damage. And all that's pretty straightforward. Certain weapon types do more damage against certain armor types, vice versa. So that's all pretty easy to get. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that. So for more on armor types, you can check out our combat prep video that we did before this, and we kind of went over the armor types. But now that we know that armor and weapons are going to come in different tiers that affect DPS and damage mitigation, and the higher your infamy, the higher tiers you will be able to craft. So it's going to be on a progression system to get, to craft the higher tier weapons, armor, which, are going to protect you more and do more damage. So the one thing that all the ships in this game will have in common is weak points. So there's kind of two different ways they're doing this. NPC ships have different weak points than the ones captained by a player. And they're going to be highlighted in red whenever you're in combat. Just because they're highlighted in red doesn't mean they're going to be easy to hit. So depending on where the weak points are, depending on which ship it is, some weak points are going to be harder to hit than others. So they're still going to be, even if they're highlighted, it's still going to take a little strategy, a little maneuvering to be able to hit those weak points. Now, we do know that when you do hit the weak points, it's going to do like massive damage, they say, but it's also going to do effects on the enemy ship. And they haven't really said into detail like what those effects are from hitting the weak points, but they say that they're going to be spectacular. So I guess we'll wait and see. But at least the massive damage you can count on and whatever effects go with hitting the weak points. So in addition to weak points, we'll also be dealing status effects in the forms of buffs on us and our team and debuffs on the enemies. Some of the buffs include heal over time and increase speed. And some of the debuffs are, of course, like dot damage and things like that. You can get buffs before combat by eating certain foods or using certain weapons, and some of the furniture that you put on your ship. And you can also, and what's interesting about like debuffs and that you're going to be putting on the enemy is that they build up to more devastating effect. So it's like stacking debuffs, basically. Like fire, flooding, and tearing, you can speed up the process depending on the areas that you target and as far as how quickly they build up. So the example they give is like fire status builds if it hits the sail or hull and does large damage for short time. Flooding builds up if it hits the ship's hull and does low damage over time, but continues until manually removed, which is interesting because I wonder if that can be removed during combat. I would assume it could be. And then like, what's the mechanic for doing that? Do you just use a repair kit and heal up, or how do you manually, remove some of these stackable debuffs that are going to get inevitably put on you? And the last tearing builds up if it hits the ship's sail. Now it doesn't do any damage as it like stacks. But what's cool about tearing is it's gonna immobilize the enemy ship for a short time. And also what's nice is like any weapon can do tearing damage, but spiked weapons and specific weapons that say anti-sail effects are they're gonna create those stacks much faster and be much more efficient at it. So besides the weak points, like I said, we're going to have status effects to deal with, trying to land those debuffs, buff you and your team, trying to maneuver to hit the weak points. Besides status effects, now we move on to crew to crew maneuvers. So normally, like when you're not in combat, you're going to have your crew morale bar, which is going to be what keeps your crew happy. And then if it drops too low, that's what triggers your crew to mutiny. So that outside of combat, that's going to be normally how you see it. But during combat, it'll be replaced by a crew fury bar. It increases with successful attacks and combat maneuvers. And once it's filled, you can do what they call a crew-to-crew maneuver, which are going to be your much more powerful attacks. It says, once it's full, you can transform your crew's fury into powerful attacks. Timed correctly, you can board and sink enemy ships. And if you board them, that actually gives you a lot more loot. It's a much more lucrative way to take down the enemy. But you would, of course, know that it's high risk, high reward. So, of course, getting the most out of looting your enemies is not going to come without a certain degree of risk. And that comes in the form that you will be opening yourself up to a potential counterattack whenever you try to do one of these boarding maneuvers. And probably just as important as, hitting the weak points and the firepower and the debuffs and all those things is the last kind of part of combat, and that's outmaneuvering your opponents. So what you need to realize is that when it comes to fighting these fights, it's not just your opponents you have to worry about when you're trying to maneuver around and you're jockeying for position, because there's also going to be like areas of shallow water and things like that you're going to have to navigate while in the mix of this ship to ship fight. You're going to be having to look out for hazards and things like that too. So maneuverability really comes in big, especially, if you have a ship that's fast and nimble. And, you'll be good at outflanking, your enemies. But if you load down weapons and weapons and weapons, you're going to, that ship is going to hit like a fucking freight train, but your maneuverability is going to be pretty low. So if you can get it lined up, you're going to do massive damage. But that's the question. Can you get it lined up if you have a nimble ship that's literally sailing circles around you? And some of the things that you can do to like pick up speed is, while you're trying to outmaneuver your enemies, you have to think about like wind direction and even the shape of your sails, because they all play a factor in even getting side by side another ship to like not take damage for like a broadside attack. Also, you can even give the order to trim the sails to pick up speed. Like if you're going to ram the enemy ship, you can give that order, pick up speed, go in, get the wind behind you, and you can do a lot more damage if you consider like a lot of these elemental things. And, whenever you go to, make your attack. So it's definitely more than just point your weapon at the enemy ship and press the fire button and spam it, and whoever has the highest tier weapon does the most damage. There's way more to that with this ship to ship combat, which is a really good thing, because it's going to go a long way for this game not to become stale. The success is in the details. And as long as this game can walk the line between like a fun pirate adventure and like a naval combat simulation, because we don't want too much of either, it should be a shit ton of fun. So I'm definitely looking forward to it. Like I said, I was kind of happy reading this, because the combat seems more complex than I thought it was going to be. And, when you're trying to cleanse debuffs and land buffs on you and your team, you're trying to heal your team, you're trying to jockey for position, you're watching out for, rocks and cliffs and shallow water while you're trying to get around to hit a weak spot. That's a lot going on, especially if there's multiple ships there. It sounds like it can get pretty hectic, which really will make it come down to skill at that point, which is really the whole point. So are you going to be a skilled captain or not? I guess we'll see, because I guess your crew's depending on you. And last but not least, remember that doing that boarding maneuver whenever you get that fury meter full, it will be the best way to get the loot versus like sinking the ship from afar and then going through the wreckage and trying to find stuff, because inevitably some of it's going to, it's going to sink. So that's definitely the best way to get the loot. And I do wonder about that counterattack, because that's going to be interesting to know that it's not a given, especially if you've got like low health on your own ship because you just went through that entire fight and you're trying to do this boarding maneuver. You might end up getting sunk just trying to get the most loot, trying to be a little greedy. You might end up getting your own ship sunk. So you gotta really think about these sort of things. All right. So that was the dev spotlight on what ship-to-ship combat's going to be like. So far, they're not saying much that I don't like, so I'm still pretty excited to try this out and see where this game goes. The next time we talk about Skull and Bones, we're going to get into how to engage and defeat like forts and wealthy settlements. I hope it's challenging because it's supposed to be, you know, the most challenging of their content that they've talked about so far. So I hope it's pretty challenging, especially if this is going to be, like I said, that in-game PvE thing that you're going to want to do, that you're supposedly, you know, you might want to recruit friends to help you take these things down. So that would be really cool if that's the case, because, you know, the PvP is going to be fun, but you need challenging PvE content too to make kind of a rounded game. Can't have too much of one or the other, have a nice balanced game. So I definitely look forward to that. But that's for next time. So thanks for stopping by, guys. Subscribe and like to keep up with me and the Skull and Bones as the release gets closer. And I'll see you guys next time. And remember, always keep your target in the scope.